Upper Michigan, 1873. On the coldest night anyone in the township could remember, every cabin along the wagon road sat dark and shuddered against the wind that came off Lake Superior like something with intentions. Ice crystals drove sideways through gaps in log walls. Frost crept across interior surfaces the way mold creeps across bread, slow and certain and impossible to stop. In cabin after cabin, children coughed in their sleep, the sound carrying through walls that were supposed to keep the winter out but had long since surrendered to it. Every cabin except one. On the south road, half a mile past the last stand of white pine before the land opened into cleared quarter sections, a single window glowed with the warm yellow of a well-trimmed lamp. The glass was nearly clear. Not the opaque white sheet that every other window in the township had become, but actual clear glass with only a thin tracery of frost along the very edges like lace on a collar. Through that window, if you had been standing outside in the 30 below dark, you would have seen two children sitting on the floor. Not huddled near the stove the way children in frontier cabins huddled, but sitting comfortably in the middle of the room, a slate between them, drawing pictures of horses that had never existed and would never exist except in the mind of a 4-year-old girl who had not yet learned that imaginary things were supposed to be less real than actual ones. Their mother sat nearby with a piece of mending in her lap. She was slight in the shoulders, dark-haired and possessed of the kind of stillness that some people mistook for shyness and others mistook for not having anything to say. She was neither shy nor silent. She was listening. She was always listening. Right now, she was listening to the wind outside and to the absence of wind inside and to the small brass thermometer hanging on the back of the front door, which could not make a sound but which was telling her something all the same. It read 51 degrees. Outside, the matching thermometer nailed under the eaves read 20 below zero. 71 degrees of difference. And the stove was barely running. A modest fire, the kind you would keep in a cabin on an October evening, not the roaring, desperate blaze that every other household in the township was feeding just to keep the frost from growing on the inside of their own walls. Something was different about this cabin. Something invisible, something buried. And the story of what lay beneath that warm floor began 8 months earlier, in the spring of 1873, when a widow stepped down from an ox cart onto a piece of land her dead husband had never lived to see. Elvira Rochdale arrived at her quarter section in the second week of April with 2 children, a wagon load of household goods that smelled of salt air and cedar, and a folded letter from the land office that her late husband Wardell had signed but never used. Wardell had died of pneumonia in February, 3 weeks before they were to have left their rented rooms in Portland for the new country. He had been sick for almost a year before that, the kind of slow-wasting illness that hollows a man out from the inside while his wife watches and pretends she does not see the hollowing. Elvira had watched. She had not pretended. And when Wardell died, she had buried him on a Tuesday, sold his tools on a Wednesday, and booked passage west on a Thursday because the land office letter had an expiration date and grief did not pay for food. The journey from Maine to Michigan took 6 weeks. She traveled with Ira, who was 7, and Florinda, who was 4, and who clung to her mother's skirts at every river crossing with the fierce grip of a child who has recently learned that fathers can disappear and has not yet been convinced that mothers cannot. At the second river, a ferry operator looked at Elvira standing alone on the bank with 2 children and a loaded wagon, and he told her he did not carry women traveling without a man. It was not safe, he said. It was not proper. Elvira reached into her coat pocket, pulled out a coin purse, counted out double the fare, and set it on the railing without a word. The ferry operator looked at the coins. He looked at Elvira. He looked at Ira, who was standing very straight beside his mother, with his jaw set in an expression that was identical to hers. The ferry operator picked up the coins and untied the rope. Elvira did not thank him. She simply led the wagon aboard and stood at the rail, watching the far bank approach, one hand on Florinda's shoulder, the other on the sideboard of the wagon, and her face showing nothing at all. That was who Elvira Rochdale was. Not a woman who did not feel fear, a woman who did not let fear make her decisions. They reached the quarter section on a cold April afternoon, when the ground was still half frozen and the trees were weeks away from leafing out. The land was flat and partially cleared, with a glacial deposit of fieldstone at the back of the property and a small creek running along the southern boundary. Elvira walked the perimeter while the children sat in the wagon eating the last of the bread she had brought from the final trading post. She walked slowly, looking at the ground, looking at the drainage, looking at where the wind came from and where the snow would drift. She was not looking at the land the way a farmer looks at land. She was looking at it the way her father had taught her to look at things, which was to say, she was looking for what was underneath. That first night she lay in the wagon bed with both children asleep against her sides, and she listened to the wind off Lake Superior. And she cried. It was the first time she had cried since the funeral. Not because she was afraid, although she was. Not because the land was harsh, although it was. She cried because she had made it, and there was no one to tell. Wardell should have been lying next to her in this wagon. Wardell should have been the one walking the perimeter. She had arrived at the place they had planned together, and the other half of together was in a cemetery in Portland. And the word arrived meant something different when you said it alone than when you said it with someone. She cried quietly the way she did everything, and she stopped before Ira stirred, and she wiped her face with the back of her hand, and she lay in the dark listening to the wind and thinking about salt. Salt was what she knew, not the way a scholar knows a subject from books, but the way a cooper knows oak or a blacksmith knows iron. She had grown up on the coast of Maine where her father Stedman Webb had worked at the salt evaporation pans that supplied the cod fishery. Her childhood had been measured in tides and brine. She had watched salt being harvested in broad, shallow pans under the summer sun. She had watched it being stored in wooden sheds where the air always felt different from the air outside. She had watched it being loaded onto wagons and hauled to the curing houses where cod was packed for shipping to cities she had never seen. And she had noticed things. She had noticed that the salt sheds never grew the black mold that crept into ordinary storerooms by August. She had noticed that salt blocks left in the cellar through summer felt cool to the touch long after the air around them had warmed. She had noticed that on damp days, the salt seemed to pull moisture out of the air itself, and on dry days, it seemed to give moisture back, as though it were breathing in some slow mineral way that had nothing to do with lungs. Her grandmother had noticed these things 2 decades earlier. Her grandmother had told her that the old houses along the Maine coast had once kept salt blocks under their hearthstones to steady the heat in the air both. It was an old practice, older than anyone could remember the start of, and it had faded when cast iron stoves arrived because the stoves seemed to solve the heating problem so completely that no one thought about what else the salt had been doing. But the old women remembered. The old women always remembered. Elvira remembered. The cabin she intended to build would be small, 20 feet by 16 with a single sleeping loft for the children and a main room where she would cook and sew and live. She had the dimensions clear in her head. She also had something else clear in her head, something she had been thinking about for the entire journey from Portland, something that had nothing to do with the shape of the walls and everything to do with what would go underneath them. She went to find Levi Kellogg on the 3rd day. Levi lived in a cabin 3 miles north, a man of mixed Ojibwe and French descent, who took on building work between trapping seasons and who was known in the township for 2 things: The first was that he was the best carpenter within 30 miles. The second was that he almost never spoke. Elvira arrived at his door with Ira and Florinda trailing behind her, and when Levi opened it, he looked at her, then at the children, then back at her. "What do you want to build?" he said. "Not where is your husband? Not why is a woman hiring a carpenter? Just what do you want to build?" Elvira understood in that moment that she had chosen correctly. She told him about the cabin, the dimensions, the sleeping loft, the chimney placement. Levi nodded at each specification the way a man nods at things that make sense. Then Elvira told him about the floor. She wanted, she said, a continuous low stone wall around the perimeter, 18 inches high. Inside that wall, she wanted the earth dug down an additional 6 inches and the space filled with a tight grid of salt blocks. Rock salt, the pink kind cut from deposits south of the Great Lakes and shipped up by freighter. She wanted 700 pounds of it laid edge to edge on a bed of clean, dry sand 4 inches deep, packed tight and leveled flat. Levi's expression did not change, but his eyes sharpened. Above the salt, Elvira continued, she wanted 2 layers of tar paper, the kind used in roofing, sealed at every seam with hot pitch so that no water could pass through from above. Above the tar paper, a layer of split cedar shakes laid flat to create an air gap of roughly half an inch. And above the cedar, the floorboards themselves laid with hairline gaps between them. The kind of gaps that a careless carpenter produced by accident and a careful one produced on purpose. She explained why. The salt would sit close enough to the living space to exchange heat and moisture with the cabin air through those hairline gaps. But the tar paper would prevent any groundwater from reaching the salt and dissolving it. The sand bed would drain laterally toward the east side of the foundation, where she wanted a small weep hole built into the lowest course of stone. The cedar shakes would create a ventilation channel that allowed slow passive movement of air vapor between the salt bed and the room above. 700 pounds of crystallized salt, she told Levi, represented a considerable amount of mass. Mass holds heat. A wood stove heats a cabin during the day, but at night when the fire is banked low, the heat dissipates through the log walls and the cabin temperature plunges. Most families compensate by keeping fires dangerously hot through the night, which wastes wood and creates the dry, overheated air that cracks lips and splits the skin around fingernails. But if there is a heavy layer of dense material beneath the floor, that material absorbs heat during the day and releases it slowly through the long hours after midnight. The temperature still drops, but it drops gradually instead of plunging. That was the thermal effect. But salt did something else that stone alone could not do, something her grandmother had understood without needing a word for it. Salt breathed. It steadied the air around it the way a calm person steadies a room full of anxious ones. Elvira did not yet have the scientific language to describe exactly how this worked. She only knew that her father's salt sheds had always felt different from ordinary rooms, and that the difference had to do with something the salt was doing to the moisture in the air. She would learn the precise mechanism later. For now, she knew what the salt did. She did not yet need to know why. Levi listened to all of this without interrupting. When Elvira finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked her one question. "How do you plan to keep the salt dry?" Elvira smiled. It was the first time she had smiled since Wardell died, and it surprised her almost as much as it surprised Levi. That, she said, is the question that matters. And she told him about the tar paper, the pitch, the drainage slope, and the weep hole. She told him about her father's salt sheds where blocks were stored for years in conditions harsher than anything she planned to build, and they did not dissolve because they were never allowed to sit in liquid water. Vapor was fine. Vapor was the whole point. Liquid was the enemy. Levi nodded slowly. Then he said with the careful honesty that was the only kind of honesty he practiced, "Nobody in this township is going to understand what you are doing." "I did not come to Michigan to be understood," Elvira said. "I came to keep my children alive." They started work the second week of May. The black flies had just begun to make outdoor labor miserable, and the ground was finally soft enough to dig. The stone foundation took 11 days, with Levi quarrying fieldstone from the glacial deposit at the back of the property and Elvira working alongside him to mortar the courses with lime she had bought in Saginaw and slaked herself in a wooden trough. By the time the foundation wall was complete, word had gotten around. Titus Quimby came first. He held the section to the east of Elvira's claim and considered himself the unofficial mayor of the unincorporated township. He was a big man, late 40s, with hands that had built things and a voice that carried the weight of a man who had been right about enough things in his life that he had stopped considering the possibility that he might be wrong about anything. He rode over on a Tuesday morning and leaned on his elbows on the top course of Elvira's foundation wall and told her she was building it wrong. "Too low," he said. "You want at least 3 feet of stem wall up here, 4 if you can manage it. Otherwise the snow drifts against your sills and you have got rot in your floorboards before the next thaw." Elvira thanked him for his concern. She asked Levi to keep working. The wall stayed at 18 inches. Titus came back the following week. This time he saw the trench dug inside the foundation and the wheelbarrow loads of sand being hauled in, and his commentary took on an edge. "What in God's creation are you doing in there, Mrs. Rochdale? You are filling the inside of your own foundation. The floor is supposed to sit up off the dirt, not down in it." Elvira did not look up from the sand she was leveling. She was building the floor she intended to build, she said. Titus rode away muttering about women who would not take advice from men who had been homesteading this land since before her husband had even thought of coming here. But he did something else before he left. He stopped Levi on the road that evening and confronted him directly. "You are a carpenter with a reputation," Titus said. "You are really going to build that woman's lunatic floor design." Levi looked at Titus with the expression of a man who had seen enough strange things in his life that French widows with unusual building plans did not register very high on his scale of strangeness. "She is paying," Levi said. "She knows what she wants. I build." Titus shook his head and rode off. But from that day forward, he told everyone at the trading post about the crazy salt floor the widow on the South Road was putting in. And people listened because Titus was Titus. And when Titus said something was foolish, most people in the township accepted his judgment and moved on. The salt arrived at the end of June. 740 pounds of it packed in oiled canvas sacks, shipped by lake schooner to a small landing on the Michigan shore, and then hauled overland by ox sled. The blocks were roughly the size of a man's 2 fists, pressed together, tumbled smooth during transit, pink and heavy and smelling of deep earth. The freight driver who delivered the load looked at the half-built cabin and then at the small mountain of salt sacks he had just unloaded and asked Elvira not unkindly whether she was setting up a fish curing operation. Elvira told him the salt was going under her floor. The freight driver removed his hat, scratched the back of his head, and said in the tone of a man who had given up trying to understand his customers many years ago that he hoped it worked out for her. Word spread through the township in 2 days. By the time Elvira and Levi were ready to begin laying the blocks, 6 neighbors had ridden out to see what the French widow was doing now. Titus brought his brother-in-law. Festus Bracewell had built houses in 3 different territories and considered himself an authority on construction in cold climates. He was a tall man, late 50s, with a carefully trimmed beard and the bearing of a man who had been consulted on important matters and intended to go on being consulted. He stood at the property line for nearly an hour watching Levi and Elvira fit the salt blocks into the sand bed with the focused precision of two people who understood exactly what they were doing and did not need an audience to do it. His face went through several distinct expressions before settling on the one he wore when he finally spoke. Madam, Festus said, with the elaborate courtesy of a man who has decided he is dealing with a person not entirely in possession of her faculties. That salt is going to dissolve the moment groundwater reaches it. By the spring thaw, you will have a brine soup under your floor, and by next summer, you will have rotted joists and sagging boards. I beg you, before you go any further, let me introduce you to a gentleman who can help you build this house properly. Elvira stood up from her work. She was wearing a canvas apron over a dark brown work dress, and her hands were chapped raw from the salt. She thanked Mr. Bracewell for his concern. She told him the salt would not dissolve because the salt would not be wet. She told him about the tar paper and pitched the drainage slope the weep hole. She told him she had grown up watching her father store salt blocks in conditions far harsher than these, and they had never dissolved. Festus Bracewell listened to all of this with the patient expression of a man hearing a child explain how the moon was made of bread. When she finished, he tipped his hat, told her he would pray for her, and rode away. He never came back. He never changed his mind. He simply disappeared from the story the way people do when they have decided that they already know everything worth knowing and that nothing new is going to get through the door they closed years ago. The mockery that followed was steady but not vicious. The settlers of the township were mostly decent people who did not wish Elvira harm. They simply did not believe that a woman who had never built a cabin before could possibly know something that the men who had built dozens did not. They said her father must have been a strange man to raise a daughter so set on doing things backward. They said the salt would draw mice by the thousand. They said the cabin would smell of brine. They said her children would grow sickly from breathing salt air. None of these things would turn out to be true, but the saying of them filled the conversations at the trading post and the Sunday gatherings, and Elvira heard most of them because in a township of 60 households, there are no secrets, only varying speeds of delivery. Then came the voice she had not expected. Pastor Giles Ravenscroft rode out to Elvira's property on a Sunday afternoon in late July. He was a man in his early 60s, lean and careful, and he carried the moral authority of the only minister within 20 miles. He did not come to talk about salt. "Mrs. Rochdale," he said, standing at the edge of her work site with his hat in his hands, "I understand you have engaged Mr. Kellogg to do construction work for you. A man on your property for many days running. You understand that in a small township, people will talk." Elvira felt something shift in her chest. This was not about salt. This was not about foundation walls or drainage slopes or the thermal properties of crystallized minerals. This was about a widow's reputation. A widow who had hired a man, a widow who spent her days working alongside that man in plain view of anyone who rode past. The pastor was not accusing her of anything. He was warning her that other people might, and that if the community decided she was not a respectable woman, no amount of clever engineering would protect her or her children when winter came and she needed neighbors willing to help. "Pastor Ravenscroft," Elvira said, and her voice was as level as the sandbed she had spent the morning grading. "Mr. Kellogg is a carpenter I hired with money I earned selling my late husband's tools. My son, Ira, is present on this work site every day. If anyone has questions about the propriety of my arrangements, I invite them to come and ask me directly." The pastor nodded. He said he had only wanted her to be aware. He put his hat back on and rode away. Elvira sat down on the foundation wall after he left. The mortar was dry and warm under her hands. Ira was playing at the edge of the clearing with Florinda, throwing pine cones at a stump. The sky was the pale blue of a Michigan summer, and the air smelled of fresh-cut cedar and lime dust and faintly salt. She was afraid, not of the winter, not of the salt dissolving or the floor failing or Festus Bracewell being right. She was afraid of the people. She was afraid that in a place where she had no family, no history, no husband, to stand between her and the judgment of a community that did not know her, the whispered opinions of decent people could become a wall higher than any she could build. That night, after the children were asleep, she lay in the half-finished cabin and considered for the first time since leaving Portland whether she had made a mistake coming here. Not a mistake about the salt, about everything, about trying to build a life in a place where she would always be the outsider, the widow, the woman who did things no one understood. The next morning, Florinda ran into the work area, wrapped her arms around her mother's leg and said, "Mama, our house smells like Grandpa's." She meant the salt. She meant the clean mineral smell of Stedman Webb's evaporation sheds in Maine, a smell that Florinda should not have been old enough to remember but somehow did. Elvira looked down at her daughter and understood that she did not have any choice except to continue. Not because continuing was brave, because stopping was impossible when a 4-year-old girl was standing barefoot on a salt bed and smiling about her grandfather. The cabin went up through July and August, squared log walls tight, chinking a peaked cedar roof, a stone chimney rising from the north wall. Levi worked with the silent efficiency of a man who builds things the way rivers carve valleys, not by force but by persistence. Elvira worked alongside him every day, and Ira worked alongside both of them, carrying tools and fetching water, and learning without anyone telling him he was learning how a house is put together from the ground up. Keturah Fairholm came to watch. She was the only one who did not mock. A widow herself, early 40s, living alone on a small claim a mile south Keturah, had survived 2 years of solitary homesteading through the kind of stubborn, quiet competence that earns respect even from people who do not particularly want to give it. She came to Elvira's work site 3 or 4 times a week, bringing bread or eggs or sometimes just her own company, and she watched Elvira work with the focused attention of a woman who had buried a husband and learned in the burying that other people's certainty was usually worth less than they charged for it. On the day the salt was finally laid and the tar paper went down, Keturah sat on the foundation wall and asked Elvira in the careful way she asked everything whether she was certain the system would work. Elvira said she was not certain. She was hopeful. She had reasons to be hopeful that came from what she had seen as a child and from what her grandmother had told her and from what made simple physical sense when she thought it through carefully. But the only way to know whether the system would work in this place, in this climate, in this soil, was to live through a winter under it. Keturah nodded slowly. That, she said, is the most honest answer I have heard from anyone in this township in 3 years. Neither woman noticed Verena Quimby sitting on her horse at the edge of the tree line, close enough to hear. Verena was Titus's wife, a woman in her mid-40s who had come to see the spectacle her husband kept describing at supper. She had expected to find what Titus described, a confused widow wasting money on a foolish project. Instead, she had heard Elvira say, "I am not certain," and the honesty of it had landed somewhere unexpected. Verena rode home and Titus asked her what the widow was doing now. Verena did not repeat the joke he was expecting. She said, "Mrs. Rochdale knows what she is doing." Titus waved his hand dismissively. But Verena remembered, and in the months to come, what Verena remembered would matter more than what Titus dismissed. The floor went down in early September. Cedar shakes laid flat over the sealed tar paper, and above them the floorboards fitted with the hairline gaps Elvira had specified. When Levi set the last board and Elvira swept the cabin clean, for the first time she stood in the doorway looking at what she had built, and she felt something move inside her chest that she had not felt since Wardell died. She had a house. Her children had a house. And beneath their feet, invisible to anyone who walked through the door, was a layer of pink crystallized stone that her father would have recognized at a glance and her grandmother would have approved of in her quiet, fierce way. The first frost came on September 18th, 2 weeks earlier than the township average. By the 1st of October, ice was forming on the rain barrels at dawn. By the end of the month, a thin powder of snow covered the ground every morning when Elvira stepped outside to split kindling. She put her palm flat against the floor on the first October morning that showed snow. The boards were cool, but not cold. She held her hand there for a long time, feeling for something she could not yet name. She thought about Festus Bracewell saying she would have brine soup under her floor by spring. She thought about the 740 pounds of salt she had spent nearly all of her savings on. She thought about what would happen if the salt dissolved, if the tar paper failed, if the drainage slope she had calculated was not steep enough. She would be broke. She would have a cabin with a ruined floor. Her children would spend the winter in a house worse than any other house in the township, because at least the other houses had solid ground beneath them, and hers would have a dissolving mess. She did not sleep that night, but in the morning she got up and split kindling because that was what needed to be done, and Elvira Rochdale had never in her life failed to do the thing that needed to be done, whether she had slept or not. Winter was coming, the real winter, the one with teeth, and Elvira Rochdale, 31 years old, alone with 2 children, on a frozen quarter section in Upper Michigan with 700 pounds of salt buried under her floor, and the judgment of an entire township riding on whether she was a visionary or a fool, stood in her doorway and watched the first real snow begin to fall, and wondered which one she was going to turn out to be. The first cold snap of the season arrived on the 7th of November, like a debt collector who had been patient long enough. The temperature fell to 12 below zero before dawn and stayed there as though it had found a place it liked and intended to settle in. The wind shifted to the northwest and drove fine snow through every crack in every cabin in the township, the kind of snow that was not really snow at all, but a dry powder of ice crystals that found gaps no human eye had ever noticed and announced them with a thin white line on the floor. Elvira woke in the dark. The stove had burned down to coals during the night, and she expected what she had always expected on mornings like this in the rented rooms of Portland and the boarding houses of her journey west. She expected the floor to punish her feet the moment they touched it. She expected that particular sharp bite of cold wood against bare skin that makes a person want to stay in bed until spring. She put her feet on the floor. The floor was warm, not hot, not like the surface of a heated stone, but warm in the way that a living thing is warm, a faint, steady heat that rose through the boards and met the soles of her feet and told her something that no thermometer could have said more clearly. The salt was doing what salt does. The mass beneath her floor had been drinking heat from yesterday's fire all through the daylight hours, and now in the deepest cold of the early morning, it was giving that heat back. She knelt and laid her palm flat against the boards. She held it there for a long time. The warmth was real and it was steady, and it was coming from below, from 700 pounds of crystallized stone that every experienced builder in the township had told her was a waste of money. Elvira sat on the floor in the dark with her hand pressed against the warm boards, and she thought about Wardell. She thought about him the way she had not allowed herself to think about him in months, not as a problem to be solved or a grief to be managed, but as a man, her husband, the father of the children sleeping in the loft above her. She thought about the way he would have looked at this floor, the way he would have crouched down beside her and put his own hand on the boards and looked at her with that particular expression he wore when she surprised him, which was often because Elvira was a woman who surprised people, and Wardell had been a man who enjoyed being surprised. She whispered into the dark cabin to no one, to the salt beneath her feet, to the memory of a man who was not there. I built it, Wardell. It works. Then she wiped her eyes and got up and lit the stove and made breakfast for her children, and she did not mention the floor to either of them because she was Elvira Rochdale, and Elvira Rochdale did not make declarations. She waited for evidence. She gathered evidence. And over the next 3 days, the evidence gathered itself. Her wood consumption was running below what she had budgeted. The cabin held a temperature difference of roughly 60 degrees against the outside air with what felt like modest fires. And the air inside the cabin felt right. Not dry the way overheated cabins felt, the kind of dryness that cracked lips and made noses bleed. Not damp either. It felt balanced, comfortable, like air bomb that had been attended to by something patient and invisible. At the trading post that week, Verena Quimby was standing near the dry goods counter with her oldest daughter, a girl of 12, who was coughing in that wet, racking way that children cough when the air they sleep in is wrong. The cough had been going on for a week, and Verena had tried everything she knew, which was everything her mother had known, which was hot tea with honey and a wool cloth pressed against the chest and prayers that were growing less patient by the day. Keturah Fairholm was at the post the same morning. Someone asked her how the winter was treating her so far, and Keturah, who never exaggerated and never complained, said it was the usual. Cold. Damp inside, frost on the walls. Then someone asked whether she had been out to the Rochdale place recently, and Keturah said she had, and someone asked what it was like in there. And Keturah said, without meaning to start anything, that Elvira's cabin was warm enough that you could walk barefoot on the floor at dawn. The trading post went quiet for a moment, the way trading posts do, when someone says something that doesn't fit the story everyone has agreed on. Verena Quimby heard it. She did not say anything. She bought her flour and her thread, and she rode home with her daughter coughing beside her on the wagon seat. That night she lay in her own cabin, which was a good cabin, a cabin her husband had built with his own hands and was proud of, and she listened to her daughter cough. And she looked at the frost growing on the inside of the east wall, and she thought about what Keturah had said. Barefoot on the floor at dawn, in November, in Upper Michigan. The next morning, Verena said to Titus, "Maybe you should go see Mrs. Rochdale's cabin." Titus looked up from his coffee. "What for?" "To find out why your daughter is coughing and her children are not." Titus did not answer, but the sentence stayed in his head the way sentences do when they carry a weight that the speaker did not intend, but the listener cannot put down. Keturah came to visit Elvira on the third evening of the cold snap. She rode over on a borrowed mule wrapped in a buffalo robe with her cheeks chapped raw from the wind. She stamped the snow off her boots at the door, and Elvira let her in, and Keturah stopped in the doorway. She stood very still. Her eyes moved around the room the way a person's eyes move when they are trying to find the source of something they can feel but cannot see. The cabin was warm, not stove warm, not that blast of dry heat that hits you when you walk into an overheated room and makes your skin feel tight. This was a different kind of warm. It was even. It was everywhere. It came from below as much as from the stove. "The floor," Keturah said. Elvira nodded. Keturah pulled off her gloves. She crouched down slowly the way a person crouches when they are not sure they trust their own senses, and she laid her palm flat against the floorboards. She stayed there for a long time. Then she looked up at Elvira, and Elvira saw in her friend's face something she recognized because she had felt it herself 3 mornings ago. It was the look of a person discovering that a thing they had been told was impossible is not only possible, but is happening right now under their hand. My cabin has frost on the inside walls, Keturah said. My quilts are damp every morning. I burn twice the wood you burn, and it is still cold, and it is still wet, and my chest hurts when I breathe at night. She paused. The fire popped in the stove. Florinda turned a page of the picture book she was looking at in the lamplight. I do not understand what you have done here, but it is working. Elvira invited her to stay the night. Keturah stayed. She slept in clean, dry blankets on the floor near the stove, and in the morning when she woke, she told Elvira it was the first night in 2 years she had not woken with damp bedding. She rode home carrying in her head the first description of Elvira's floor that anyone in the township would hear from a sympathetic source. 3 weeks later, the real storm came. December 2nd, 18 inches of snow in a single night, temperature dropping to 22 below zero by morning. Wind at 40 miles an hour for 2 straight days, the kind of wind that does not blow past a cabin, but leans against it, testing every joint and every chink and every gap where oakum has shrunk or mortar has cracked. For 2 days, the township shut down completely. No one reached the trading post. No one rode the wagon road. Families sealed themselves inside with whatever firewood and food they had and waited. In the conventional cabins, something happened that the settlers knew well but had never found a way to prevent. The hot air from their stoves rose to the ceiling and pressed outward against walls that were frozen solid, and when that warm, moist air met those cold surfaces, it dropped its moisture the way a wrung cloth drops water. Condensation formed on the inside of every wall. It froze into thick, clear sheets. It coated window glass until the glass was opaque. Bedding that touched the walls grew damp and then rigid with frost. The air near the stove was scorching and dry. The air near the floor was cold and wet. And between those two zones, the family tried to exist in a narrow band of merely uncomfortable. In Elvira's cabin, none of this happened. The floorboards stayed warm. The walls, while cold to the touch near the outside, did not develop the thick frost sheets that covered her neighbors' interiors. The air was neither parched near the stove nor soaked near the corners. It was simply air. Elvira and the children spent the storm reading by lamplight and telling stories and doing the things that families do when they are warm and dry and safe and have nothing to fear from the weather except its sound. On the second night of the storm, Elvira heard something that stopped her. She was banking the fire for the night, pushing coals to the back of the firebox and closing the damper to a crack when she caught a sound beneath the wind. Faint, barely there. A thin liquid whisper like water running over stone somewhere underground. She froze. She got down on her hands and knees and pressed her ear to the floorboards. The sound was clearer from there. Water. Moving water. Somewhere beneath the floor on the west side of the cabin. Elvira's heart did something it had not done since the ferry crossing. It lurched. She understood instantly what was happening. The wind had shifted during the storm and driven snow against the west wall of the foundation, the side where she had not built the drainage grate as high because she had misjudged the prevailing wind direction. The snow had piled against the foundation stone. The bottom layer pressed against the masonry had begun to melt from the faint heat radiating outward through the foundation wall. Meltwater was running along the outside face of the foundation looking for a way in. If it found a way in, it would reach the sandbed. If it saturated the sand, it could seep upward through any imperfection in the tar paper seal. If it reached the salt would dissolve. And if the salt dissolved, everything she had built, everything she had spent, everything Festus Bracewell had predicted would come true. 8 months of work, nearly all of her savings, gone. She did not wake the children. She pulled on her heavy coat and her boots, and she opened the front door into a wall of wind and snow that hit her like a slap. The thermometer under the eaves read 22 below. The wind was strong enough that she had to lean into it to stay upright. She fought her way around to the west side of the cabin. In the dark by feel, she found what she expected. Snow had drifted against the foundation to within inches of the top course of stone. The bottom of the drift was saturated with meltwater that was running in a slow trickle along the base of the wall. She began to dig. Her shovel was in the tool shed 30 feet away, and she could not reach it in the wind, so she dug with her hands. She scooped snow away from the foundation in great double armfuls, working by feel, her fingers going numb within minutes, and then passing through numb into a deep aching burn that she ignored because ignoring pain was something she had gotten very good at during the years of Wardell's illness. The cabin door banged open behind her. Ira stood in the doorway in his nightshirt, his face white, his eyes wide. "Mama, get back inside, Ira." She did not raise her voice often. She had raised it perhaps a dozen times in Ira's entire life. She raised it now, and the sound of it against the wind was sharp and strange, and Ira's eyes filled with tears, and he stood in the doorway crying while his mother dug snow in the dark with her bare hands at 22 below zero. Elvira dug until she could see the foundation wall clearly from the base to the top course. She ran her fingers along the joint where the stone wall met the tar paper that extended outward from beneath the floor. Most of the seal was intact. The pitch she and Levi had applied was holding, but at the southwest corner she felt it. A crack, perhaps 6 inches long, a place where the pitch had contracted in the cold and separated from the stone, leaving a gap just wide enough for water to seep through. She needed to seal it. She needed pitch. The pitch was inside in a small tin she kept near the stove for exactly this kind of repair. But pitch needed to be heated to flow. She went back inside. Ira was still standing at the door, still crying silently. Elvira knelt in front of him and put her frozen hands on his shoulders and said, "I am sorry I yelled at you. I need to fix something outside. Our house is going to be fine." She heated the pitch on the stove until it was liquid. She carried the tin outside, crouched at the southwest corner of the foundation in wind that was trying to take the tin out of her hands, and she pressed hot pitch into the crack with her fingers because she had no brush and no time to find one. The pitch was hot. Her skin was cold. The combination produced a pain that was specific and memorable, and that she did not make a sound about. She sealed the crack. She packed snow back against the foundation in a slope berm that would direct future meltwater away from the wall rather than toward it. She went back inside. Her hands were burned on 2 fingers where the hot pitch had sat against frozen skin. She wrapped them in a clean cloth and sat down next to the stove and listened. No water sound. The seal was holding. She sat there until dawn, her ear tuned to the floor, her burned fingers throbbing, her children asleep above her in the loft. When the first gray light came through the east window, she put on her coat again and went outside and checked the west foundation. The pitch seal was solid. The drainage berm was intact. Water from overnight snowmelt was running exactly where she wanted it to run, along the outside of the foundation and away to the east where the weep hole would carry it clear. The system had not failed. Her design was sound. What had failed was her execution, a single application of pitch that she had not inspected carefully enough during construction. The flaw had been there since August. It had taken the worst storm of the season to reveal it. Elvira stood in the early morning cold looking at the repaired joint, and she felt 2 things simultaneously: relief that the salt was safe, and a deep private anger at herself for the carelessness that had nearly cost her everything. She went back inside and made coffee and waited for the storm to break. It broke on the morning of the 4th. Elvira put on her snowshoes and walked the half-mile to Keturah Fairholm's cabin because she had been worried about her friend through the entire storm, and she needed to see for herself. What she found was a small disaster. Keturah's cabin had held against the wind. The structure was sound, but the inside was a ruin of ice and damp. The walls were sheeted with frozen condensation. Keturah's bedding was soaked through. The food stores in the corner were dusted with frost, and Keturah herself was lying in bed with a fever, shivering under quilts that were stiff with ice where they had touched the wall during the night. Keturah had been burning wood as fast as she could feed it through the storm. She had kept the stove running at a level that risked chimney fire, and still she had woken on the second morning to find frost growing on the inside of her own quilt, on the surface that had been touching her body as though the cold had reached through the fabric and found her. Elvira did not hesitate. She got Keturah up. She bundled her in every dry thing she could find. She put out the fire properly. She gathered enough of Keturah's belongings for a week, and she walked her friend back through the snow to her own cabin, half carrying her over the last quarter-mile when Keturah's legs began to give out. By that afternoon, Keturah was lying in clean, dry blankets in front of Elvira's stove, sweating out the fever in air that was warm and properly balanced for the first time in days. 2 days later, Pastor Giles Ravenscroft came to visit. He arrived on horseback, his face grim with cold, and with something else, something that Elvira recognized immediately as the expression of a man who has come to deliver a moral judgment and has already composed the words in his head. He stamped the snow from his boots. Elvira invited him in. He stood just inside the door and looked at Keturah, who was sitting up now, wrapped in blankets, drinking broth. "Mrs. Rochdale," the pastor said, "I have heard that Mrs. Fairholm has been staying in your home." "She has," Elvira said, "for several days. She nearly died in her own cabin, Pastor. She had a fever and frozen bedding, and no one within walking distance who could help her." The pastor folded his hands. "I am not questioning your Christian charity, Mrs. Rochdale. I am asking whether you have considered how this arrangement appears. 2 widows living under one roof, in a township that has already had occasion to discuss your, shall we say, unconventional domestic arrangements." Elvira had been patient with this man before. She had answered his concerns about Levi with the measured courtesy she used for all people who questioned her without understanding her. She had absorbed his warning about reputation with the quiet pragmatism of a woman who understood that perception mattered in a small community even when perception was wrong. But Keturah Fairholm had almost died 2 days ago. She had almost died because her cabin could not do the one thing a cabin is supposed to do, which is keep a human being alive through winter. And this man, this careful moral accountant, had come to Elvira's warm, dry, perfectly functional cabin to ask whether it looked proper. "Pastor Ravenscroft," Elvira said, and her voice was different now. Not loud, not angry exactly, but stripped of every layer of deference she had been applying to her dealings with the township since April. "Mrs. Fairholm nearly died Friday night. She woke up with ice on the inside of her own blankets. If you want to discuss propriety, I suggest you discuss it with your God and ask him why her cabin could not keep her alive and mine could." The pastor did not move. He did not speak. He looked around the cabin slowly, and what he saw Elvira knew was nothing he could argue with. The cabin was warm. The air was comfortable. 2 children were sitting at the table, healthy, clear-eyed, not coughing. A sick woman was recovering in clean bedding. The thermometer on the door read 50 degrees. Outside, it was 14 below. Pastor Giles Ravenscroft, who had been dispensing moral guidance in this township for nearly 2 decades and who was not accustomed to being spoken to by women in the tone Elvira had just used, opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He said nothing. He tipped his hat. He turned and walked out into the cold. It was Katura's illness, more than any thermometer or any explanation Elvira could have given, that began to turn the township. Katura was widely known and widely liked. She had survived 2 years of widowhood through competence and quiet dignity. When word spread that she had nearly died in her own cabin and been saved by spending a week in the salt floor house, people began asking questions they had not been willing to ask before. Titus Quimby came 3 days after the pastor's visit. He arrived with the air of a man preparing to debunk a confident scheme. He stamped snow at the door. Elvira let him in. Titus did not stop in the doorway. He did not look around in wonder. He did not crouch down and touch the floor. He walked straight to the thermometer on the back of the front door and read it. 51 degrees. He walked outside, read the thermometer under the eaves, 9 below. He came back in and stood in the center of the room with his hands in his coat pockets and his jaw working as though he were chewing on something that would not go down. "Mrs. Rochdale," he said without quite looking at her, "why is my cabin 30 degrees colder than yours when my stove is twice the size of yours and I am burning 3 times the wood?" "The floor," Elvira said. Titus looked at the floor. The floor looked like a floor. He asked her what the salt had cost. She told him. He did the arithmetic in his head, and his face went a shade darker. "That is more than 2 extra cords of firewood for the winter, and a man can cut his own firewood. Salt has to be hauled from Saginaw. 2 extra cords," Elvira said, "would not keep your inside walls dry. They would not hold your thermometer at 51 on a 9 below day with a moderate fire. And they would not stop the cough I heard your oldest daughter developing at the church gathering last Sunday." Titus Quimby stood in Elvira Rochdale's cabin for another long minute, looking at the floor that looked like a floor, and then he left. He did not mock her on the way out. He did not say anything at all. He simply mounted his horse and rode east toward his own property, and Elvira watched him go and knew with the quiet certainty of a woman who understood men better than most men understood themselves that something had broken inside Titus Quimby that afternoon, and that what grew back in its place would be different from what had been there before. January came, and it came with teeth sharper than November, sharper than December, sharper than anything the township had experienced in 15 years of settlement. The thermometer at the trading post dropped below 20 and stayed there for a full week. Dr. Hosea Upchurch, the only physician within 30 miles, rode 11 miles on the 8th of January through cold that made his horse's breath freeze in solid clouds. He was treating pneumonia in 3 cabins, frostbite in 2 others, and the condition he had taken to calling winter cough in nearly every household he visited. He arrived at Elvira's door half frozen and entirely curious. He had heard from 3 separate sources that the conditions inside her cabin were unusual. He was a man trained in medicine when medical training was uncertain and new, and he had learned in 15 years of frontier practice to pay attention to any evidence that did not match his expectations. Elvira gave him hot coffee and let him examine the cabin however he wished. Dr. Upchurch spent nearly an hour. He measured air temperature in 3 locations with instruments he carried in his bag. He checked the floor surface temperature at 6 points. He examined the windows. He looked at Ira's hands, which were not chapped. He looked at Florinda's complexion, which was not raw. He listened to both children's chests with the wooden tube he used for auscultation. He listened to Elvira's chest. Everything was clear. Every airway was open. Both children were breathing the way children breathe when the air they live in is correct. He sat down at Elvira's table and asked her very seriously to explain what she had done. Elvira explained. Dr. Upchurch listened the way few people in the township had ever listened to her, which is to say he listened as though what she was saying might be true. When she finished, he asked specific questions. How thick was the tar paper layer? How was the air gap ventilated? Had she observed any salt crystallization on interior surfaces? Had the children shown signs of skin irritation, eye irritation, or excessive thirst? Elvira answered each question. Dr. Upchurch set down his coffee. He spoke slowly. He told Elvira that he had read in his medical journals about something the German researchers were calling hygroscopic regulation. The principle was that certain materials, when incorporated into the structure of a building, could moderate the relative humidity of the indoor air without any active intervention. Salt, he said, had a critical relationship with water vapor that was governed by the ambient humidity. Below a specific threshold, around 75% relative humidity at room temperature, salt retained the moisture it had absorbed. Above that threshold, it absorbed moisture aggressively from the surrounding air. The practical effect in a cabin like Elvira's was that the salt bed acted as a buffer. When indoor humidity rose from cooking steam or breath or wet clothing, the salt absorbed the excess. When humidity dropped from the drying effect of the stove, the salt released moisture back. The exchange was continuous, passive and automatic. He told her this was the first time he had seen the principle applied outside of a European laboratory. He told her the implications for frontier health were significant. He asked her permission to write a report for the Detroit Medical Journal. Elvira said he could write whatever he liked. Dr. Upchurch rode away that afternoon into the cold, but before he left, he stood in her doorway and said something that Elvira would remember for the rest of her life. Mrs. Rochdale, I have been treating sick people in this township for 15 years. Most of the illness I see in winter is caused not by the cold itself, but by the air people breathe inside their own homes. You may have solved a problem that I have been trying to solve with medicine, and you solved it with salt. He tipped his hat, but the gesture meant something different from Festus Bracewell's hat tip 7 months earlier. Bracewell's hat tip had been a dismissal. Upchurch's was an acknowledgement. The coal broke on the 17th of January. The township began the slow process of digging out and counting losses. 3 families had lost livestock. 2 cabins had structural damage from ice loading on roofs. Nearly every household had at least one member with serious respiratory complaints. And in the slow social aftermath, as people gathered at the trading post and at Sunday meetings and compared their experiences of the worst winter in 15 years, the conversation kept returning to the woman on the South Road whose livestock had survived, whose roof had not failed, whose children were not coughing. The mockery was over. It had ended quietly sometime in mid-January, replaced by a careful, respectful curiosity that was harder for Elvira to navigate than the mockery had been, because mockery she understood and respect she was not accustomed to. By the end of February, 3 families had asked Elvira directly whether she would help them build similar floors in their own cabins. Elvira said she would help however she could, but she warned them the work could not be done in winter. The ground was frozen too hard to dig, and salt could not be laid in freezing conditions without risking condensation that would dissolve it before the system could be properly sealed. They would have to wait for spring. And then at the end of January, a letter arrived. It came by way of the trading post addressed in a firm commercial hand to Mrs. M. Rochdale, and it was from Kenelm Prescott, the freight merchant, who had delivered 740 pounds of salt to her property the previous June. He had heard, he wrote, from Dr. Upchurch about the remarkable performance of her cabin. He wished to visit. He said, a business proposition. Elvira read the letter at her kitchen table while Keturah mended a shirt by the stove and the children worked at their lessons in the loft. She folded the letter and put it in the drawer where she kept important papers. She did not reply, but she remembered the name and the word proposition and the particular feeling she got when someone used the word business in a sentence directed at something she had built with her own hands. Spring was coming. The worst winter in 15 years was ending. And Elvira Rochdale, who had arrived in this township 11 months ago as a widow with 2 children, and a wagon load of salt that everyone told her was a waste, was about to discover that being proven right could be just as complicated as being told she was wrong. Spring came late that year, the way it always comes late in Upper Michigan, not as a gentle turning of the season, but as a slow, grudging retreat of something that does not want to leave. The ice on the creek broke in the second week of April with a sound like gunshots echoing across the flat land. By the end of the month, the ground was soft enough to dig, and Elvira Rochdale was standing in Titus Quimby's cabin, watching him tear up his own floor. He did it himself. No one asked him to. No one stood over him and said, "Now do you see?" He simply arrived at Elvira's door one morning in late April with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that Elvira had never seen on Titus Quimby before, a look that cost him something to wear, and he asked her whether she would help him install a salt bed under his cabin. The work was harder on an existing structure than on a new build. The foundation had to be modified, the old floor joists pulled up and discarded, the earth inside the perimeter dug down to accommodate the additional depth the system required. Titus and his 2 sons did the heavy labor. Elvira walked the property, checked the soil drainage, calculated the salt load for his larger cabin, and supervised the critical steps: the grading of the sand, the placement of the blocks, the sealing of the tar paper. She did not do the physical work. She had decided during the long weeks of late winter, while letters arrived from strangers asking for her plans, that she would consult but not construct. Her own land needed working if she was going to keep title to it. Her children needed a mother who was present, not a mother who spent every summer rebuilding other people's houses. But she was present for the moment Titus needed her to be present, for which was the moment he stopped working and looked at her and said something that did not come easily to him. "Mrs. Rochdale, I owe you an apology." Elvira set down the level she was holding. Titus was kneeling in the trench he had dug inside his own foundation, his hands caked with wet sand, his shirt dark with sweat. His 2 sons were working at the far end of the cabin and could not hear. "Not because I was wrong about the engineering," Titus said, though he paused here and his jaw tightened because admitting even this much was clearly costing him something. "Although I was wrong about the engineering, but because I did not listen. You stood right there on your own property and told me what you were building and why, and I heard the words, and I did not listen to them, because I had already decided that you could not possibly know something I did not know." Elvira looked at this man who had spent the previous year dismissing her as a confused widow and who was now kneeling in his own dirt asking her forgiveness, and she felt something unexpected. Not vindication, not satisfaction. Something softer and more complicated than either of those, something closer to the feeling she had when Ira learned a new word or when Florinda ran across the yard without stumbling. She felt the particular tenderness of watching someone become a better version of themselves, which is a thing that costs the watcher nothing and gives them something that has no name. "You are here now," Elvira said. "That is enough." The retrofit took 6 weeks. 900 pounds of salt, a rebuilt foundation, every layer of the system Elvira had designed installed under her supervision. When it was finished, Titus paid her in coin and in barter, And then he did something that mattered more than any payment. He told people. Titus Quimby, who had spent the previous decade considering himself the most knowledgeable builder in the township, stood at the trading post counter and told every man who came through the door that the salt floor Elvira Rochdale had designed was the most important piece of frontier engineering he had ever seen. He said it without hedging. He said it without adding but or however or considering the circumstances. He said it the way a man says a thing when he means it completely and does not care what it cost him to be heard saying it. Coming from Titus, this was a public conversion of a kind that does not happen often in small communities. People listened. By the end of June, 4 more families had asked Elvira for help with similar installations, and Elvira realized with a kind of quiet startlement that she kept to herself that she had accidentally created a business. She talked it through with Keturah and with Levi. The arrangement they settled on was simple. Elvira would consult on design. Levi would do the construction. Elvira would charge a modest fee for her time. Levi would charge for his labor and split a portion of his fees with Elvira for her ongoing technical guidance. And Elvira would write a detailed description of the system in clear, plain language that any literate person could follow if they wanted to attempt the work themselves without hiring anyone. The description would be free. She would not charge for the knowledge itself, only for her time. This decision, which Elvira made without drama and without speeches, would turn out to be the one that defined the rest of her life. But before it could play out, she had to deal with Condensation Prescott. He arrived at the end of May riding a good horse and wearing a coat that was too fine for the township, and that announced him before he said a word as a man from somewhere else. Condensation Prescott was in his mid-40s, lean and deliberate, with the eyes of a man who looked at every situation and saw its commercial potential, the way a surveyor looks at land and sees its boundaries. He was the freight merchant who had shipped Elvira's salt the previous summer, and he had been paying attention ever since. He had talked to Dr. Upchurch. He had read the article Upchurch was preparing for the Detroit Medical Journal. He had done arithmetic. And the arithmetic, as he explained to Elvira while sitting at her kitchen table drinking the coffee she had offered him with the same courtesy she offered every visitor, was very favorable. Mrs. Rochdale, Condensation said, and he leaned forward in his chair with the focused energy of a man presenting an opportunity he believes is irresistible. I will supply salt free of charge to you and to every homeowner you design a floor for. In return, you sign an exclusive agreement. Every salt floor in the Great Lakes region uses salt I transport. Your name goes on the marketing. Rochdale Salt Floor System. We advertise in the Detroit papers. I handle distribution. You handle design. We both prosper. Elvira listened. She was quiet for a long time after he finished, long enough that Condensation shifted in his chair. No, she said. Condensation blinked. You do not want the money. I want money, Mr. Prescott. I am a widow with 2 children on a quarter section in Upper Michigan. Of course I want money, but I will not lock this knowledge behind an exclusive agreement. My father did not sell people the right to store salt. My grandmother did not charge for the old ways of building. This is something people share because it keeps people alive. It is not something people own because it makes people rich. She told him what she intended to do instead. The written plans free to anyone who asked. The consulting fees for her time. Levi's construction business for those who wanted professional installation. Condensation shook his head. You are giving away a fortune. I am giving away something that was never mine to keep, Elvira said. I am only the person who remembered it. Condensation was quiet. He was not an unkind man. He was a practical man, and practical men have difficulty understanding decisions that are made on the basis of something other than practicality. He tried one more approach. He turned to Levi, who was sitting at the far end of the table repairing a saw handle, and who had not said a word during the entire conversation. "Mr. Kellogg," Kenelm said, "perhaps you and I could discuss a separate arrangement. You are the one doing the construction. You are the one with the skills that people are paying for. There is no reason you could not work with me directly." Levi set down the saw handle. He looked at Kenelm for a long moment, and then he spoke the longest sentence Elvira had ever heard him speak. "Mrs. Rochdale taught me how to build that floor. She paid me fair wages when nobody else in this township would hire a man who looks like me without making sure I knew they were doing me a favor. She has never once looked at me like I needed someone to explain things to me slowly. And you think I am going to go behind her back for money?" Levi picked up the saw handle. The conversation was over. Kenelm Prescott rode away that afternoon without an agreement, but he was a practical man, and practical men adapt. 3 months later, he came back with a different proposal. He would transport salt to anyone Elvira recommended at a fair price with no exclusivity. Elvira would receive no commission and owe no obligation. Kenelm would make his money on volume. Elvira would keep her freedom. Elvira agreed. It was an arrangement that worked for both of them, and it lasted for years. Through the summer of 1874, Levi built or retrofitted 6 cabins with salt bed floors. Elvira consulted on everyone walking the property, checking soil, calculating loads. The fees she earned modest, as they were allowed her to hire help for the spring planting on her own land and to build the root cellar she had wanted from the beginning but could not afford the previous year. The 4th cabin they worked on belonged to a family named Aldridge. Elvira had met them only once during the initial consultation. She had drawn the plans, specified the materials, and walked through every step with Mr. Aldridge before Levi began construction. But Aldridge was a man who believed he knew better than plans, the way some men believe they know better than recipes, and he had made 2 changes without telling anyone. He had used 1 layer of tar paper instead of 2 because the second layer seemed like an unnecessary expense. And he had skipped the drainage grade on the east side because, as he told his wife, the ground looked dry enough. In September, after a heavy rain, groundwater found its way through the single layer of tar paper and dissolved a section of salt in the northeast corner of the cabin. Aldridge came to the trading post and announced in a voice loud enough for everyone in the building to hear that the Rochdale salt floor system did not work, and that he had wasted good money on a scheme that any sensible man could have told him was foolish. Elvira heard about it from Keturah that evening. She rode to the Aldridge cabin the next morning, examined the damage, and understood immediately what had happened. The tar paper had failed because there was only 1 layer of it. The drainage had failed because there was no drainage. She did not blame Aldridge. She did not point out that he had changed her specifications without consulting her. She looked at the ruined corner of salt, and she looked at the intact sections where the double layer of paper would have been if Aldridge had followed her plans, and she said, "I will fix this, and I will rewrite the instructions so this cannot happen again." She and Levi repaired the Aldridge floor at no charge. They dug up the dissolved section, relaid the sand bed, installed new salt blocks, applied double tar paper, and built the drainage grade that should have been there from the beginning. Aldridge watched the work with the sheepish silence of a man who knows he is at fault, but has not yet located the words for admitting it. That night, after the repair was finished, Elvira sat at her own kitchen table with a lamp and a pen and the original instruction document she had been sending out to correspondents. Keturah sat beside her mending. The cabin was quiet. The children were asleep. "I'm afraid," Elvira said. Keturah looked up. "Not afraid the salt does not work. I know it works. Afraid that no matter how clearly I write the instructions, people will cut corners. And when they cut corners and it fails, they will blame the system. And if enough people blame the system, no one will try it again. Keturah was quiet for a while. The lamplight made her shadow long against the wall. You cannot control what people do with knowledge you give them, Keturah said. You can only control whether you give it or not. Elvira looked at her friend. She nodded. She picked up the pen and went back to writing. The new version of the instructions was twice as long as the original, with specific warnings at every step about what could not be skipped and why. She sent it to every correspondent who had written to her, and she sent it to Kenelm Prescott to include with every salt shipment, and she kept a copy on her own shelf next to her grandmother's Bible and the land office letter that Wardell had signed. The second winter came. 1874 into 1875, milder than the first, but still a real winter. 6 cabins now had salt floors. Dr. Upchurch measured every one with the brass instruments he had ordered from Detroit. His findings went to the medical journal and in March. The results confirmed what Elvira had known and what the township had spent the previous year learning. The salt floor cabins held steady through the cold. The respiratory complaints he tracked mapped directly to the humidity data. His article was reprinted in 2 regional journals. Letters began to arrive at Elvira's cabin from Wisconsin, Minnesota, and northern Ontario. Elvira sent the plans to everyone who asked. She charged nothing. She asked only that they write back with their results. Most of them did. Her correspondence file grew through the late 70s into a small archive of frontier building experience, dozens of cabins across the upper Midwest reporting back on their first and second winters. Some had problems: inadequate drainage, contaminated salt, tar paper applied carelessly. Elvira wrote back to everyone with specific advice for their specific situation, and the network grew slowly and quietly, the way useful knowledge grows when it is not guarded or monetized, but simply shared by people who believe that keeping each other alive matters more than keeping each other at a commercial distance. There was a Sunday in the spring of 1875 when Pastor Giles Ravenscroft stood at the front of the small meeting house and delivered a sermon that did not mention Elvira Rochdale by name, but that everyone in the room understood was about her. He spoke about the nature of wisdom and where it comes from. He said that wisdom sometimes arrives from sources we do not expect, and that the duty of a Christian is to listen before passing judgment. He said that the meek do not always inherit the earth on a schedule that the rest of us find convenient, but they inherit it all the same. Elvira was sitting in the 3rd row with Ira's hand in her left and Florinda's in her right. She did not look up. She did not need to look up. Keturah, sitting beside her, touched her elbow very lightly, and the 2 women sat in the quiet of that small acknowledgement, and neither of them needed to say a word. The pastor never apologized directly. He was not built for direct apology. But from that Sunday forward, when Elvira's name came up in township conversation, Pastor Ravenscroft did not allow the old mockery to surface, and that silence from a man whose voice carried the weight of 20 years of moral authority was its own kind of retraction. That same spring, Verena Quimby came to Elvira's cabin alone without Titus carrying a cake and a question. "Mrs. Rochdale," she said, sitting at the kitchen table where so many consequential conversations had taken place, "would you teach me to read your building plans? I want to understand the floor that my husband now boasts about, as though he invented it." Elvira laughed. It was a real laugh, unrehearsed and uncontrolled, the kind of laugh that surprises the person producing it. She could not remember the last time she had laughed that way. She sat down with Verena and spread the drawings on the table and showed her how to read them, the elevations and the cross-sections and the drainage calculations. And Verena listened with the focused attention of a woman who had spent her life being told that building plans were not for women, and who had decided at the age of 46 that she was finished being told. It was the first afternoon in Elvira's time in the township that felt like something other than work or worry. It felt like friendship between equals, which is a thing that Elvira had not had since leaving Maine, and which she had not realized she was missing until it was sitting across the table from her eating cake. Verena came back the following week and the week after that. She brought her oldest daughter, the one who had coughed through the first winter, and the girl sat at the table beside her mother and learned to read building plans the way other girls in the township learned to read sheet music or sewing patterns. By the end of summer, Verena could calculate a salt load for a standard cabin without looking at the reference tables. She never built a floor herself, but she understood what her husband had built, and the understanding changed something between them that had needed changing for years. Titus stopped talking about the salt floor as though it were his idea. He started talking about it as something Elvira had taught him, and the difference in phrasing was small, but the difference in meaning was not. By 1878, 23 of the roughly 60 households in the township had salt bed floors. Elvira was 36 years old and financially stable for the first time in her adult life. The consulting fees and the partnership with Levi had allowed her to improve her own property hire, seasonal help for the farming, and put away money for Ira's apprenticeship and Florinda's schooling. She was courted respectfully by two different men over those years. She told both of them with the same quiet courtesy she had used for every difficult conversation since arriving in Michigan that she was content with her life as it stood. She did not say this to be noble or to make a point about independence. She said it because it was true. She had built something, not just a cabin, but a life, and the life fit her the way a well-made garment fits closely and without pinching, and she did not see the need to alter it for the sake of convention. Keturah Fairholm moved into Elvira's cabin in the winter of 1875. Not because she needed rescuing this time, but because the two women had become a family. They shared the farm work. They shared the cooking. They shared the long winter evenings of mending and reading, and the kind of comfortable silence that exists between two people who understand each other completely and do not require conversation to prove it. Keturah's daughter, Electa, born before her husband's death, grew up in that cabin, calling Elvira aunt, and sleeping in the loft with Ira and Florinda, and believing in the uncomplicated way of children who are loved, that this arrangement of two mothers and three children was perfectly ordinary. An old Cornish woman, 2 townships over, wrote Elvira a letter in the spring of 1876, having heard about the salt floor from a traveling minister. Her name was Mrs. Winola Penrose, and she wanted to know whether Elvira was familiar with the lime and clay floors of her childhood in Cornwall, which had achieved similar effects through different materials. Elvira wrote back the same week, and the two women began a correspondence that lasted for years. They discovered across dozens of letters exchanged through mud season and blizzard and the slow, reliable mail of the frontier postal service that two entirely separate traditions on two sides of an ocean had arrived at the same fundamental understanding: that the materials of the earth properly arranged could regulate the conditions of a home in ways that machinery and fuel could not improve upon. Elvira found in Mrs. Penrose something she had not known she was looking for, which was a peer. Not a student, not a skeptic, not a neighbor who needed convincing, but another woman who knew things and who had learned them the same way Elvira had learned them, by paying attention to the people who came before. Their letters grew longer as the years went on. Mrs. Penrose described the lime floors of her childhood, how the old Cornish builders had mixed quicklime with clay and straw and packed it beneath flagstones, and how those floors had kept the damp Cornish air from rotting everything inside the house. Elvira described the salt beds and the tar paper and the drainage grades that the Michigan climate demanded. They argued gently and at great distance about whether lime or salt was the superior material. They agreed eventually that both were expressions of the same principle and that the principle was older than either Cornwall or Maine, older than any building tradition either of them could name. Somewhere in the deep past, women had noticed that certain materials steadied the air in a room, and they had passed that noticing down through generations of daughters and granddaughters until it arrived tattered but intact. In the hands of two women writing letters across an ocean in the last quarter of the 19th century. Ira grew up in that cabin and became a carpenter. He apprenticed with Levi Kellogg, and when Levi grew too old for the heavy work of foundation digging and stone mortaring, Ira took over the business. He built salt floors the way his mother had designed them, with the same careful specifications, the same double tar paper, the same drainage grades, the same hairline gaps in the floorboards. He did not innovate. He did not need to. The system worked. Florinda became a school teacher and then, to her mother's quiet pride, a nurse. She trained under the physician who succeeded Dr. Upchurch, and she spent her professional life in the township's small medical practice, treating the coughs and fevers and frostbitten hands of a community that had, thanks in part to her mother, fewer of those ailments than it used to. In 1891, a young woman from Duluth rode 3 days through autumn rain to reach Elvira's door. She was pregnant with her first child and building a homestead with her husband near the Minnesota border, and she wanted to learn to build a salt floor before winter came. Elvira, who was 49 by then, and whose hair had gone silver at the temples in the way her grandmothers had sat the young woman at the kitchen table and spread the plans and went through every step the way she had gone through it with dozens of people before her. But this time was different. This time the young woman asked questions that Elvira herself had asked Stedman Webb 30 years earlier, questions about why the salt breathed and how the sand bed drained, and what would happen if the pitch cracked in the cold. And Elvira heard in those questions the sound of knowledge being carried forward by someone who cared enough to ask the right things. The young woman built her floor that autumn. She wrote to Elvira in February to say that her baby had been born in a warm cabin with dry walls and that the child had not coughed once in 3 months of winter. It was one of the last letters Elvira received before her correspondence grew too heavy for her aging hands to maintain, and she kept it in the cedar chest with all the others because it told her something she needed to hear. The knowledge was not going to die with her. It had already left her hands and entered other hands, and those hands would carry it forward to hands she would never touch. Elvira Rochdale died on a morning in January 1906. She was 64 years old. She died in the cabin she had helped Levi Kellogg build 33 years earlier, in the bed that sat against the north wall, in a room that was warm and dry and exactly the right kind of comfortable. Ira was at her bedside. Florinda was at her bedside. Electa Coutura's daughter, who had grown up calling Elvira aunt and who was now a married woman with children of her own, was at her bedside. Coutura herself had died 3 years earlier, quietly in the same cabin, in the same kind of air, and Elvira had sat with her through that long night, the way Coutura had once sat with her through storms without needing to speak, because everything that needed saying had been said years ago. The thermometer on the inside of the front door read 62 degrees. Outside on the same January morning, it was 19 below zero. In her last hours, Elvira did something she had been doing her entire life in this cabin. She reached out and placed her hand flat on the floor beside her bed. It was the same gesture she had made on that first November morning when she knelt in the dark and felt the warmth coming up through the boards and knew that the salt was doing what salt does. She had been placing her hand on that floor every winter morning for 33 years, the way other people check the weather or wind a clock, a small daily confirmation that the thing she had built was still working, still holding, still keeping its promise. The floor was warm under her hand. She spoke to Ira. Her voice was thin but clear, the voice of a woman who had never wasted words and was not going to start now. "Tell Winola's daughter in Cornwall," she said, "that the salt still holds." Ira did not understand. He thought she was confused the way dying people sometimes become confused in their final hours, mixing up the present with the past, speaking to people who are not in the room. He held her hand and told her to rest. It was years later, after Elvira was buried beside Keturah, in the small cemetery on the ridge above the township, that Ira found the letters. Boxes of them stored in the cedar chest at the foot of his mother's bed. Letters from settlers in Wisconsin and Minnesota and Ontario. Letters from Mrs. Penrose in Cornwall. Letters from Dr. Upchurch, who had kept up a correspondence with Elvira long after he moved to a practice in Detroit. Letters from people Ira had never heard of. People who had built salt floors in cabins. He had never seen people who had written to his mother to tell her that their children were not coughing, that their walls were dry, that the air in their homes was finally, after years of winter misery, the kind of air that human bodies are designed to breathe. And he understood, reading those letters by lamplight in the cabin his mother had built, what she had meant in her last words. She was not confused. She was not talking about salt. She was talking about knowledge. The salt was the form, the knowledge was the substance. And what she wanted Ira to carry forward, what she wanted Winola Penrose's daughter to know, was that the thing their mothers and grandmothers had understood about buildings and air and the slow, patient chemistry of stone had not been lost. It had been written down. It had been shared. It had been built into the floors of cabins across 1,000 miles of frontier, and it was still there, still working, still holding long after the women who had placed it there had gone. The local newspaper carried a small obituary. It mentioned Wardell, whom she had outlived by 33 years. It mentioned Ira and Florinda. It mentioned her work as a builder's consultant and the unusual cabin she had constructed in her first year in the township. It did not mention the salt directly. It did not need to. Everyone in the township knew about the salt. Everyone knew that the woman they had buried that week had changed how people built houses in their corner of the world and had probably saved a fair number of lives in the process, and had done it all without ever once raising her voice or asking to be thanked. They had called her Madame Rochdale in the later years, the older settlers and the newer ones alike, and they said it with the particular respect that frontier communities reserve for people who have earned their authority not by claiming it, but by demonstrating it year after year, winter after winter, until the demonstration became so ordinary that people forgot it had ever been extraordinary. Every once in a while, in a cold winter, somewhere in the Great Lakes region, a homeowner pulls up a section of old wall floorboards to repair a joist or replace a sill, and they find beneath the boards and the cedar shakes and the tar paper and a century of accumulated dust, a grid of pinkish stone blocks laid in a bed of clean, dry sand. The blocks are smooth and dense and faintly translucent at the edges, and they are perfectly intact because they have never been wet, because someone designed the system that protects them with a precision that left nothing to chance. The homeowner usually does not know what they are looking at. They call a local historian or a building inspector or sometimes a neighbor who has lived in the area long enough to remember stories. And the historians and inspectors who have been around long enough to recognize the pattern smile because They know exactly what is buried under that floor. They know who put it there. They know that the cabin they are standing in has been quietly doing its work for 150 years, holding heat through cold nights and balancing moisture through dry days and keeping the air honest in a way that no mechanical system has ever quite managed to replicate. And they know, even if the homeowner does not yet, that what they are looking at is not just salt. It is the physical remains of a decision made by a woman in the spring of 1873, a woman who had lost her husband and traveled alone with two small children to a piece of land at the edge of the known world. A woman who had been mocked by her neighbors and questioned by her pastor and dismissed by every man who considered himself an expert. A woman who had knelt in the dirt and laid stone with her own chapped hands and sealed cracks with hot pitch in the middle of a blizzard, and refused through every challenge and every doubt and every cold night when she lay awake wondering whether she was right or whether she was a fool to be talked out of the floor she meant to build. The salt still holds. It held the day she laid it. It held through 33 winters of her life and through 120 winters after her death. It will hold tomorrow and the day after that, because salt is patient and stone is patient, and the knowledge of women who pay attention is the most patient thing of all. If you have stayed with this story to the end, it is because something in it matters to you. Perhaps it is the stubbornness. Perhaps it is the salt. Perhaps it is the particular satisfaction of watching a person who was dismissed by everyone around her turn out to be right, not in a dramatic single moment of vindication, but in the slow, steady, accumulating way that truth always proves itself one winter at a time. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who would understand why it matters. Share it with someone who has ever been told they did not know what they were doing by people who had never bothered to ask what they knew. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, consider doing so now, because we have more stories like this one, stories of quiet knowledge and stubborn wisdom, and the kind of practical genius that does not announce itself, but simply works year after year in the dark beneath the floor, holding everything together while the world above it sleeps.